John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to go over Supreme Court cases, and not the Supreme backpacks that all the kids have these days.
You can do it, Sean, man.
The modern Supreme Court is the judicial branch of the government, which means that they interpret what the laws of the Congress writes, which is the legislative branch. Now, this is really important because Congress may write as many laws as they want, but there needs to be someone who can determine what they mean for the everyday citizens. And throughout history, the Supreme Court has made a plethora of controversial and difficult decisions concerning the rights of people, and they'll continue to do so for the future. So it's important that we look back at history and see what the Supreme Court has decided on, and keep seeing what they're going to do in the future. Yeah, thank you.
In Gideon v. Wainwright, the court unanimously decided that the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel in criminal cases should be extended to felony defendants in state courts. They reasoned that the 14th Amendment made the guarantee of a counsel obligatory and essential to one's rights. Therefore, state courts are required to appoint attorneys for any defendants, such as those who cannot afford to retain one on their own. In Miranda v. Arizona, the court determined by a 5-4 decision that the Fifth Amendment requires law enforcement officials to advise suspects of their Miranda rights. Without saying them, it would violate the defendant's Fifth Amendment. The Miranda rights include the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and the acknowledgement that anything said can be used against oneself in a court of law.
The U.S. Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, affirms the legality of women's right to have an abortion under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, this being the Griswold v. Connecticut case. The case was filed by Norma McCorvey, known in the court cases as Jane Roe against Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas County, who enforced a Texas law that prohibited abortion except to save a woman's life. However, the court held that a woman's right to an abortion fell within the 14th Amendment. This decision gave the women the right to an abortion during the entirety of the pregnancy and defined different levels of state interest for regulating abortion in the second and third trimesters. The ruling affected laws in 46 states.
In U.S. v. Nixon, the court determined that the president does not have a right to safeguard certain information using his executive privileges from judicial review. They held that it violated due process law and fair administration of justice, and therefore the president must obey the subpoena and produce the tapes and documents. After the Watergate scandal, Nixon resigned shortly and released his tapes.
In Batson v. Kentucky, the court ruled that race-based peremptory challenges were unconstitutional. In a 7-2 decision for Batson, they ruled that these peremptory challenges violate the 6th and the 14th Amendment. Peremptory challenges allow an attorney to strike a juror for any reason without having to say why. This led to a lot of issues, specifically surrounding African American defendants, because attorneys would strike all of the African American jurors using peremptory challenges and would lead to an increased conviction of African American defendants. So they created the Batson rule, which said that you cannot use peremptory challenges to strike based on race. However, this doesn't really work in practice because it's hard to prove that they are violating the Batson rule because they don't have to state why they're striking a juror.
The 2000 Bush v. Gore Supreme Court decision was very conflicting and affected the American voters across the nation. This is because in Florida there was a severe huge voting machine error, and thus both candidates, Bush and Gore, Bush versus Gore asked for a manual recounting procedure. This case eventually made it to the Supreme Court, but whereas the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of George Bush in the case, saying that the Supreme Court explained that the state of Florida violated the 14th Amendment by enacting a recounting procedure. Specifically, the recounting procedure violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Thus, in general, the Supreme Court ruled that George W. Bush will become the President of the United States. This decision was very conflicting as it was only won by 5-4. But ultimately, George Bush did take the office after a very difficult election And he became the President of the United States because of this Supreme Court case.
In Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, the court ruled that corporate funding for political broadcasts could not be regulated. In a 5-4 decision for Citizens United, the court ruled that the First Amendment protects companies. In this case, the company Citizens United wanted to create a documentary that in the end stated why you should not vote for Hillary Clinton in the upcoming election. They were sued, this went through many courts, and it ultimately came up to the Supreme Court to decide whether the First Amendment protects a company's right to free speech. It is widely debated today, and people often go into the Supreme Court hearings during other cases and announce to the court that they should overturn the Citizens United decision, and then are ushered out by court security. In the end, the case ruled that corporate funding couldn't be limited during election times, and that companies had a right to free speech. In Obergefell v. Hodges, the court ruled that same-sex marriage must be legal in all 50 states. In a 5-4 decision for Obergefell, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment guarantees the right to marriage. The dissent argued that it wasn't in the power of the court to regulate the marriage, but in the end, they ruled that it was a fundamental liberty.
Some of the Supreme Court justices are John G. Roberts, who is a conservative and also the Chief Justice, Stephen G. Breyer, who is a liberal, Brett M. Kavanaugh, who is a conservative, Sonia Sotomayor, who is a liberal, Neil M. Gorsuch, who is a conservative, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a liberal, Samuel A. Alito Jr., who is a conservative, Elena Kagan, who is a liberal, and Clarence Thomas, who is a conservative.
Alright, so that was a lot of cases that we just reviewed, but it's really important to understand the role of the Supreme Court in today's government because they're important for huge checks and balances, which is judicial review. Congress and executive branch make the laws and implement them respectively, but what it means is done by the Supreme Court. So we just learned about a lot of different cases and how it affected the rights of everybody. And so it's really important that we also learn about the Supreme Court and keep following it on their decisions in future cases because the rights that they dictate can affect our daily lives. So this has been Crash Course U.S. History about the Supreme Court, and hopefully you learned a lot of really important information. And I'm John Green, and this video is supported by Monte Vista U.S. History and Mr. Henry because the College Board will always love you.